This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs. And I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. In this podcast, I talk to women entrepreneurs at every stage of their journey about the challenges, the highs, the lows, and what they've learned along the way. We'll also hear from experts who share valuable tips on how to succeed the smart way. Let's jump in. How do you translate a burning social purpose into a functioning real-life organization? How do you make the biggest dent you can with the limited means you have? And how do you do all of this while knowing nothing about your subject or the business when you first start out? In this episode, neuroscientist turned social entrepreneur Tina Tang describes how she founded Deathless and canceled crushing debt totaling tens of millions of dollars, starting with just $2,000, how she learned to fundraise, the nitty-gritty of starting a nonprofit, how she stays true to mission, and much more. Now let's get Deathless with Tina Tang. Good afternoon, Tina. It's great to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
So you're a neuroscientist that has trained in a totally different field, and then you turned to addressing the debt problem in the USA. That's a pretty unconventional journey. How did that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely been a journey. I think at the time when the idea for Debtless was first born, I was still very much on the path of becoming an academic neuroscientist. This was just something that I was passionate about. I was really passionate about social change, about politics, about advocacy. At the time this idea was born, I don't know if I necessarily saw that as a career path rather than just something that I was spending a lot of my free time in. And I was constantly trying to figure out, how do I fit all of these things, extracurriculars, into my regular schedule? I felt like I was almost forced out of my career of science because it was an environment that was very toxic. But like looking back, really feeling like it was just a blessing in disguise that now I get to do this full time.
Great. We've talked about this, and I know this is Deathless. So
Yeah.
What is Deathless? What does the organization do?
So Deathless is a 501c3 organization. We're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is really pretty simple. We want to fully disrupt the predatory debt industry through debt cancellation and financial education. So how do we do that? We do that by purchasing debt on the secondary market, and we discharge that debt for the benefit of the borrower. That is really our entire mission and what we strive for since we started. I think most of us are familiar with the concept of debt, where you borrow money, whether through a credit card or student loans or a car loan, a mortgage, whatever it is. Essentially, you borrow money upfront and you pay it back installments, right? That's debt. And with those installments, you often pay back fees and interest on top of whatever those installments are. Your original creditor, who you own that money to, is now entitled to sell this debt. They can sell it as many times as they like, from creditor to creditor, from collector to collector. And that's essentially the marketplace that I'm talking to when I refer to the secondary market, when this debt from the principal gets sold and bought and sold and bought and sold. So we come in at this point in the market where people's debts are being sold, all sorts of different kinds, and we're able to purchase that debt. The nice thing is that you actually don't need the $100,000 to purchase $100,000 of debt. Debt is sold on pennies on the dollar. A quick way to illustrate this is with an example, in that the first debt portfolio we purchased was valued at $2 million worth of debt. We have since discharged all $2 million of that debt, but we actually purchased that for $2,000, just a little over. It was $2,000 and I think a couple dollars and cents on top of that. And we were able to discharge all $2 million. And even last week, I saw a debt portfolio that was on sale in the market for $5,000, and the portfolio was valued at $25 million. You don't need the face value of the debt to purchase and cancel it, which makes our operations and fundraising a little bit easier.
So not only are you the first nonprofit founder we're interviewing on Invisible Inc., so congratulations, but it's also one of the most unusual sources of ideas. Where did this come from? How did you even stumble on this idea?
I was really fortunate. I had a co-founder. We had this idea together, and we were really inspired by a late night segment by John Oliver back in 2016. Again, I was saying both of us really into, political advocacy, spend a lot of time watching late night talk shows, who's talking through the news of the day. And in this episode, I think 2016, he canceled $15 million of medical debt on air by it was just huge TV spectacle by pressing this giant red button, confetti fell from the studio, whatever. And we were really enamored by this idea that what a really cool TV gimmick, but what does this say about our entire debt system that somebody, a late night host can do this on air? What ins and outs went into making this happen? Is this replicable? Can we do it? Can somebody else do it, right? Is this a replicable thing that we can do? So we really started doing a lot of research into how did the process work? Are other groups, people, individuals, organizations doing this? We did find a couple that have done similar work in the past. And then another angle for us as we really dug into this debt cancellation, debt activist space was that as two students of color at the time, to be perfectly frank, we didn't feel represented in what we saw. We knew that communities of color were disproportionately shouldering predatory debt, including student loans. We knew that eliminating debt is one of the most direct ways of closing the racial wealth gap. But a lot of times that's not really how debt is discussed. Debt isn't talked about in a way that disproportionately affects communities of color. And we really wanted to shed light on that. And again, didn't quite start out thinking this is going to be a C3 nonprofit. It was kind of like, this is interesting. We all have our day jobs, but let's find time to dig into this more to see what this is about. Really, we wanted to come up with something that was going to help the communities that we come from, which ended up being this nonprofit.
So you have the idea, you're excited. I can see why it would be inspiring. What happens next?
We really then kind of had to dig into, so how do we make this happen? So we figured out that, we can replicate it. So what's the next step, right? We learned that we actually needed to be a C3 nonprofit rather than any other type of organization, because part of the debt cancellation process is that if a creditor cancels or discharges your debt, for example, you actually have to report that debt to the IRS as income. That took us down a whole rabbit hole of learning about how the IRS is actually a huge debt holder, that actually people declare bankruptcy after going into tax debt. I've actually heard, personal stories from folks as we've done more advocacy about how tax debt has affected their lives. So we knew that we didn't want to help people by kind of solving one problem and creating another. And the neat thing about us having to be a C3 nonprofit is that we actually operate what the legal term is called detached and disinterested generosity. So we actually cancel the debt as a gift. We don't know any of the borrowers personally. We don't have people apply to have their debt canceled. We actually purchase portfolios with thousands and thousands of people in it at a time, and we don't know anything about the individuals, and we then discharge that debt. So we have no personal stake in the matter. So because of that, we can call it a gift. They don't actually have to report that to the IRS as income. So once that debt is gone, it's gone. So because of that, we're like, okay, in order to do this, we have to be a C3. We can't just be two individuals buying and forgiving debt. And we actually were very lucky in that in Chicago, there's a Chicago Lawyers Committee, and they actually connected us with pro bono legal team from Skadden Arps, who actually helped us with a lot of creating our bylaws. This is how you need to create a board. We're like, great. What's part of a board? Let's make a board. Writing out what our operations is going to be, figuring out some very, very early financial projections, filing all the paperwork, both at the state and the federal level. That whole process probably took over a year from start to finish. So even though we had kind of started this digging process in 2016, we were not a registered nonprofit until the end of 2019. A bit of a journey.
It's fascinating how much you had to learn across business, across the tax code, and a whole bunch of other things, the secondary debt markets. How equipped did you feel? What concerns did you have? And how did you cross that mountain of learning that you needed to cross?
I don't think I felt equipped at all, to be honest, because my background was in academia at the time. For the kind of first years of Deathless operating, that was still my career path. So I really didn't have a lot of background in this. I didn't take any business classes or economic classes or anything. One of the needs that we recognize is that we have a whole generation of young people who didn't receive any financial education, multiple generations of people that didn't receive any type of formal financial education. I know the first time I got a credit card, I was like, I don't know what an APR is. That sounds great. Now I do. But I think this is such a new field for us that we really weren't equipped at the time. But I think for us, it was about kind of really remembering that we're a mission-driven organization. So no matter what we did and any decisions we made when we were creating our bylaws, when we were writing out our mission statement, when we were even writing out our financial projections, remembering that what is the end goal we're trying to accomplish here, and having that guide us and all the tools that we can learn along the way. So lots of learning.
So you're a nonprofit, but regardless, you have to be solvent and would like for you to be around for the long term. So the business model is a pretty critical component of it. How did you tackle this question of the business model, the economic model? What were the most important parts and how did you get those right?
So we knew that pretty early on we were going to be a grassroots fundraising organization. As a nonprofit, what we do is we fundraise and we use the money that we fundraise in order to purchase debt and then go towards any operations, right? And so I think for us, we made a decision that the bulk of any money we fundraise was going to go directly back into debt purchase. And that in terms of operations, we were really just going to bootstrap as much of as we possibly can. I mean, the first batch of letters we sent out, we hand stuffed those letters and hand wrote them. And then I took an Uber and delivered it to USPS to send them out. We knew early on that that's where the bulk of our money was going to be spent. And that's how we approached our financial planning, and that everything, as much as we can put into debt cancellation, that's what we were going to do. Everything else, we were going to just be as creative, as scrappy as possible. I think that's also the story that we found resonated with people, right? I think when we talk about grassroots fundraising, so many people get fundraising emails or fundraising asks or whatever it is. And there's this idea with a lot of the big nonprofits where millions and millions of dollars that are fundraised actually goes back into overhead and operation costs and CEO salaries and all of that. We're kind of like, that's not going to be us. Again, that doesn't map back to our mission. So that's actually helped us the way that we've bootstrapped our growth, because I think that story has also really helped us. And we've been able to demonstrate to our funders that really nearly every single cent coming in has been going back out, canceling debt and helping borrowers. And that's made a big impact for us. We're also really thankful that we've been able to demonstrate enough grassroots fundraising. Now we're eligible to apply for some grant funding and foundation funding. So that's kind of the next step what we're looking at right now. We actually just submitted our first grant application last week. Fingers crossed. I'm really excited about it.
Congratulations. I will keep all my fingers, toes crossed for you. A couple of interesting things that came up in your last answer there. One was you said you went and delivered the appeals yourself. That presumes that you actually had a list to reach out to. Where'd you get this list? That's essentially your first.
Oh, well, actually, let me clarify. So what we were actually delivering was, once we purchased debt on the secondary market that we talked about, we actually get a list of all the debts that are in the portfolio. So that includes the person who previously owed that debt, their contact information. And we actually are obligated to notify the borrowers that their debt has been canceled. And then we include next steps for how they can then contact their original creditor or contact their credit reporting agency in order to update their credit score and things like that. Those are the letters that we were delivering. We were sending out notification letters to borrowers that their debt has now been canceled.
So the Santa Claus letter.
Yeah.
That's lovely. So then to go back to your funding, even if it is a relatively small amount, it's still meaningful and presumably you have ambitions to scale. Can you talk about how you got funding? You talked about grassroots. How did that work out?
Yeah, absolutely. So really wild story. So I mentioned that we were incorporated as a C3 nonprofit in 2019. We had planned for launch in early 2020. To be exact, March 2020 was actually going to be our first launch event. Didn't quite work out the way we thought it was going to. Actually, I believe it was actually a week before our launch, the city of Chicago shut down. And we got that advisory where today's the last day you can be outside. And then starting tomorrow, go stay at home. So it really threw a wrench into our operations, right? We had planned this in-person launch event where we were going to introduce our mission to the community. We were going to actually do some letter writing of donations and things like that. And obviously could no longer plan an in-person event, needed to really quickly pivot. And we were really a team of, me at the time and co-founder and our board. So the easiest, lowest hanging fruit at the time was, okay, let's create a GoFundMe. Everybody's doing a GoFundMe. GoFundMe actually at the time had a platform that was called GoFundMe Charity, which is specifically for C3 nonprofits, where we essentially wrote our story. We made these little videos about why this is important, introducing people to the nature of the predatory debt industry, really highlighting the impact of even $1, $5, $10 could actually cancel thousands of dollars of debt. And we had a really modest fundraising goal. We were like, let's just raise $1,000. Let's see if we can raise $1,000. We've never done this before. Let's see how far we get. We actually doubled our goal. We raised 2,000. And that was the first 2,000 that we used to cancel the first 2 million. And then obviously we were able to kind of build a lot more momentum off of that. Since then, we've been able to transition out of GoFundMe, which we knew was never going to be a long-term solution, into a more long-term digital fundraising platform. And now we actually have a full-scale digital fundraising program where we're doing fundraising emails. Again, similar to our mission, we never want to be an org that is just constantly asking people for money. So we're doing fundraising emails, but we also have our newsletter email program that's doing like financial education tips and news on, especially now, news on student debt cancellation that's everybody's talking about. And we're hoping to essentially keep expanding digitally. We want to maybe do, social media ads in the future, because digital wasn't necessarily part of our big plan to start, and COVID hit and we had to pivot. And I think this is where we'll stay.
It's interesting because everything that you're doing is based off of this foundational plank of your being a nonprofit. Now, there are other ways that you could do it. For example, you could start a social enterprise venture, or you could do a B Corp. Is the tax implication to the borrower the only driver of the fact that it's a 501c3? Or were there other considerations that drove you away from a social impact venture or a B Corp towards a nonprofit?
I think the tax implications were definitely one of the huge factors because, again, we didn't want to solve one problem by creating another. So that was definitely a big part of our decision making. I think the second part of that for us is, when we talk about finances and financial planning and things like that, people tend to think that they're scams. I think even when we first started, we were reaching out to borrowers who didn't really think this was real. And I think for us, wanting to be a C3 nonprofit to also lend legitimacy to the cause of this is for the benefit of you, this is not for the benefit of us. I think that was also a huge part of our decision making.
So, in addition to the fact that you're a nonprofit, what other drivers or markers of legitimacy did you consciously, strategically use to build trust with the people that you were canceling debt for? And secondarily, did that even matter? Because my sense is that this is a unilateral act in the sense that you forgive it and it's done. You don't need them to consent. Is that true? And did you do anything else to build further trust?
Yes, so that is true. This is a unilateral action. We don't need them to take any sort of action in order to benefit from it, which is something that's really important to us. We didn't want it to be like you have to fill out a form or whatever it is in order to get the benefits. You believe us or you don't. This is already done, which is our goal. But I think for us, it was also about the evolution of the step we're in now of just building brand awareness and just awareness around the mission. We want to get to a place where you say Deathless and people know what we're talking about, really building up brand awareness around our mission, around what we're doing, around debt cancellation is actually a useful tool for financial freedom. And I think that's been a huge part of our mission now to kind of build up our messaging so that if people Google us, they see something that they're like, oh, this is believable.
So one other factor you mentioned was getting this board of directors or board of trustees as a nonprofit. That can be pretty challenging. I'm on 2 boards myself, so I understand how challenging it might be. Can you talk about that process, your learnings, and what advice you'd give to someone else in terms of recruiting a board of directors who's starting a nonprofit?
I think for us, when we first started, actually, we went straight to almost friends and family, where we were like, this is what we want to do. You are all the people that we know. Will you help us? And there was a lot of pros and cons we learned from that. I think a lot of the pros was we had a kind of group of people who are part of our personal networks and community, both personal and professional networks that believed in this because we believed in this. So therefore signed on to help us get started. Then we hit the bumps of working with friends and working with family when you previously weren't coworkers and now you kind of are. So I think we hit all of the typical bumps that you would expect there. Now we're at a position where we can recruit people who weren't necessarily in our personal or professional networks to begin with, but we are now consciously bringing into our network because they've bought into the mission, because they believe in what we're doing, and because they bring value to the next step of where we want to go. But yeah, definitely when we got started, it was kind of like, let's just find people who's willing to put their name on a piece of paper and let's go from there.
Can you talk through a little bit of your philosophy of kind of how you put your board together as this nonprofit?
Skills and connections play a huge part into this decision making for me, because early on when we first started, we raised 1,000. Let's raise the next 1,000. Let's raise the next 1,000, right? Like we weren't even thinking far enough in 2019 and 2020 about what the long-term connections are going to look like, what the long-term 5-year or 10-year plan is going to be. It was really kind of like, can we keep the lights on for another month? Great, let's do that. So the considerations that went into our board at the time then was people who had time to actually put into the organization. That was actually my biggest factor of like, do you have 5 hours a week? Do you have 10 hours a week? If I give you these list of things to do, can you do it in this amount of time? And that was really our early stages. I think now what I'm looking at is more, these are our 5-year goals. For example, we're applying to grants. These are our 10-year goals of wanting to build up name recognition. And a huge part of that is going to be our digital strategy. So how can I bring in people who already have experience and connections in those areas so that I can pick their brain? I don't necessarily need them at this stage to like, do you have 10 hours a week to actually do the grunt work with me? But do you have an hour a month or an hour every quarter where like I can pick your brain and like, are we going in the right direction? What do I need to plan for next? So I think definitely those considerations have changed and evolved, but for sure filling a need at every step.
That brings me to an interesting question. You want this organization to be around for the long term. And one thing that's for sure with a 501c3 is that it does impose administrative burdens in terms of reporting and transparency. And then there's a secondary question of financial management of the nonprofit itself. You want to be around for the long term. To your point, you want to manage the expenses. How do you manage those twin responsibilities of financial oversight as well as financial administration of your nonprofit?
I guess one caveat is we hope to get to a point where we don't have to exist, right? I think that should be the goal of more nonprofits, to be honest. It's not that we have to exist forever, is that we exist long enough to solve the problem and then we can stop existing. So that's the ultimate goal there. But until we get there, which is probably going to be a long time from now, I think a huge part of that is actually just how we're doing financial planning and how we're being realistic about what we're bringing in and what the administrative costs versus what the costs for debt cancellation is going to be. I've seen a lot of financial projections that are people who have come to me for help and things like that. I've seen a lot of financial projections that we always want to project the best, but that just aren't frankly realistic based on what your growth is. And I think for me, I've always just been very on the conservative side of when I'm doing projections. Like, I think this is very conservatively what we can fundraise this year. Out of this, this is what I'm going to budget in for administrative costs. Out of this is what we're going to budget in for debt cancellation, for the actual notification process. We actually just hired our first part-time staff member. So now we're budgeting in for compensation for our staff. I think being at every step, I've been probably more conservative than I needed to be, which I think now is actually paying off. We're getting to a place where, okay, we actually maybe have a little bit of breathing room, which is good.
Now, turning to your mission, right, there's obviously, unfortunately, so much debt that you can literally pick what you want and have impact. From a strategic standpoint, how do you select the portfolios, the types of debt? So, for example, you go beyond student debt, and then how do you pick the specific tranches or packages of debt that you choose to buy and then cancel or forgive?
I love this question. So thank you for asking. I talked about at the beginning, a huge part of our mission was that we felt like people of color's voices weren't really represented in the space because people of color are disproportionately affected by predatory lending, almost across every type of debt, really, if you think about it. And we wanted to really, one, focus a conversation on that. And also, two, in our actual cancellation efforts, focus on types of debts that we know are disproportionately affecting our communities. Because again, we can't go in and say, we're looking for XYZ person's debt, or we can't say segment this portfolio by race or by gender or whatever it is. But what I'm looking for when we're looking for portfolios is, one, portfolios that are actually have been charged off for a long time, meaning that people who have owed debts for a really, really long time. So we're prioritizing helping people who have been in debt for longer. So I think one of the most recent portfolios we saw had been charged off since, I believe, 2010. So it's over 10 years of somebody who had been harassed and hounded for this debt. So that's first thing we look for. Second thing, we've actually recently started a renewed focus on looking for debt portfolios that are actually payday loans, because if you really dig into the payday loan industry, there is just so much to talk about. But it's one of the debts that most disproportionately affects communities of color. It's marketed often as a alternative financial solution in banking deserts, which are areas where there's not a financial institution for, I believe, 10 miles, which are often within urban city centers or rural areas where are predominantly for communities of color. So we've been really focusing on discharging payday loans because also just there are so little regulation on the payday loan industry. I think interest rates in payday loans in the country can go up as high as over 600%, which is in Texas, which doesn't sound real. And actually in Illinois, I believe payday loan interest used to average definitely above 200% until 2021, where there was legislation that just passed that capped payday loan interest in Illinois at 36%. But even 36 is abnormally high, right? Like a credit card is maybe like 18 to 22. So I think that's one type of debt we have really decided to prioritize. And another reason for that is we wanted to plug a gap and fill a need that didn't exist already. There's already a big national conversation happening around student loan debt, and we are part of groups that are doing a lot of advocacy right now for the president to cancel student loan debt, which he literally can do today, tomorrow, whenever he wants to. So we're really hoping that bans out there. But there's a sense that student loan debt is debt that you took on to get an education, so it's somehow acceptable because someone who has like $300,000 of student loan debt, you view that person very differently than someone who has like even $10,000 of credit card debt. So that's considered somehow more acceptable. And medical debt, there's actually an organization that has been focused specifically on canceling medical debt. But again, medical debt is one of those things that also, if you tell somebody that you are $20,000 in debt because you had to get a life-saving procedure, there's not too much shame around it. But, somebody who took out $500 of a payday loan to pay utilities for the month and rent and put food on the table, who didn't pay it back, now owes this debt 10 years later, that really can keep a person down for a really long time unnecessarily. So we've really chosen to be very intentional about plugging into this need that we identified that even similar organizations are not addressing right now.
Fascinating, which brings up an interesting thought for me, which is take something like student loans. It's not a recurring debt, whereas you could make an argument that in the case of a payday loan, there's a systemic issue that's causing someone to repeatedly access this loan. So when you forgive, let's say I had a payday loan and you forgave me or forgave my loan, seems like there's an opportunity to help me on a more systemic basis, either by yourself or maybe partnering with some other nonprofit that has a complementary mission to you. Have you thought about that? And if so, do you see opportunities where there's upside there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really just the second part of our mission statement, which is not just debt cancellation, right? It's debt cancellation and financial education. One of the things that we really believe in is that if people had knowledge of what they were getting into when they take out these really predatory loans, you would take time to try to find other options. So I think that's one, that every time we cancel debt, we actually provide people with a list of resources, not only to update your credit report, but also here are some steps you can take to stay out of debt. Because yes, the rate of someone who takes out a loan, any type of loan, it's not a student loan or medical debt, and then immediately falls back into debt. Just the rate is very, very high. That's definitely financial education is a key part of that. And the other part of that we actually see as part of our advocacy work. So like we mentioned, or I just mentioned, Illinois recently passed legislation to cap payday lending, which is great. We support that. However, that actually didn't address the systemic issue because payday lenders exist in neighborhoods where there are not a lot of banking institutions. They're often the only option for people in those areas in order to get credit. So capping payday loan interest at 36% in Illinois, actually in parts of Chicago, and I'm sure other parts as well, forced payday shops to close, which in theory, you say, great, payday lender shut down, good news. But that actually leaves the people in those communities without any option for credit whatsoever. And so education alone in that scenario is not going to fix the problem. right? So we really want to grow and expand in terms of advocacy for actually more reputable financial institutions to be in those neighborhoods to really address the problem of banking deserts head on. In that, yes, payday lenders is a problem, but they are a problem that existed there to fill a need. And just because we take away the problem doesn't mean that it's no longer needed, right? So I think that's the other arm of what we want to focus on going forward. And definitely, like you mentioned, we're constantly looking for other like-minded organizations where we're doing partnerships with. We recently did a talk with the Chicago Women in STEM about how debt disproportionately affects women and what are some tools you can use in order to address that. We also recently just published an op-ed in a online magazine called In the Red, which is actually run by a group called the Debt Collective. They are actually a debtors union, and they organize debtors across the country to know your rights when it comes to being in debt. Their big focus right now is on student loan debt. So we're always looking to partner with other organizations that are aligned in mission with what we want to do, and how can we all work together to help people.
Essentially, the problem you're eventually looking to solve is financial access, especially on this angle of payday loans in particular. So changing gears slightly, what were some of the external challenges you faced from the beginning, even to the present day?
So many challenges. I think, just to, even recapping some of the things we've already talked about when we first started, just not having a background in starting a nonprofit and what we needed to do, we really could not be where we are now without even just the legal help we had to be incorporated, to fill out the paperwork, to figure out what we needed. I think that was a huge part of it. Once we were actually operational, trying to figure out, okay, how do you fundraise? I had only done student groups up until then. So the extent of my fundraising experience when we were first having this idea was like, we had bake sales. And I was like, well, that's not going to fuel us to where we need to go. So how do we move past bake sales and into actual fundraising tactics? I think I've taken a lot from different parts of my life since then, and how that informs how I run Deathless now. For a brief period, I worked at a venture-backed startup in Chicago, learned a lot about customer acquisition and funding, and just even analyzing KPIs, which I didn't have a background in. So, took a lot of that experience into how I run Debtless today. I also now work in, I made the pivot because of COVID into politics. And a lot of my advocacy work that we do with Debtless is really rooted in the things that I learned from political campaigns and from working with other nonprofit organizations. So many different challenges that I think really, for me, was just about kind of baking it till you make it and just taking it one step at a time, always being willing to learn about what's next. I think I went into this with a really open mind because I knew I had so much to learn. Really, no matter what I'm doing outside of this, it's going to become somehow applicable to what I'm doing here.
And all of this places a huge demand on your personal resources, right? Your willingness, your emotional energy. Did you have any memorable dark moments where you really came close to calling it quits? And if so, how did you find the strength to get through that?
Yeah, a lot of low points. Which one do I name? So many different low points. I'll talk about one. One example that's coming to mind right now is actually after our first initial bout of fundraising. I talked about the $2,000. We were off to a really great start. And it was kind of like, oh, wow, we had $2,000 and we canceled all of this debt. We're great. And then we kind of hit a wall of like, where does the next $2,000 come from? We can't keep doing GoFundMe. How do we evolve past that? And I think that was a very early, very low point for me of just really feeling like I was not equipped to continue to run this organization. And I think for me, just personally, a lot of time away, a lot of rest, a lot of therapy to kind of really focusing on myself, that if you take care of yourself, you have all the tools you need to succeed. You just have to access it. I know that I might not know everything, but I know that I'm capable of learning anything I need to learn. That's been a really powerful reminder for me even today, because there's still so many things today that come up where I'm like, wow, I didn't know this before today, but I have the tools of how I can find this information or who I can go to get the answer, reminding myself that you don't have to have all the answers. That just take some time away, take a nap, have a coffee, come back. You have the tools you need to get there. Yeah.
And one thing that kind of played into my mind as I was listening to you was there's a wrinkle to this challenge, right? Which is your heritage. You and I share an Asian heritage. I don't know to what extent this is true, but it's certainly true where I come from, which is women are seen, not heard. There's this question of being submissive, not rocking the boat. And I could argue that everything you're doing is all about rocking the boat. How has that played into your journey? How have you integrated that into your overall journey and into what you're doing in the next phase?
I'm a Chinese immigrant, first generation. I was born in China. And the culture that I grew up on was very collectivist, is about valuing the whole over the individual, is, it's really not the best precursor to entrepreneurship because it's not really about doing something on your own and standing out on your own. A lot of what I'm doing now has not always been supported by people in my family or people in my culture who are kind of like, you gave up a pretty relatively stable career to be in academia, which is also respected and comes with some level of just the graduate degrees and all of those things, some level of value to my family and community, and gave all that up to join a political campaign and run a nonprofit? What is that going to do? There's no stability involved in what I do today. And that is really terrifying sometimes because I definitely see the value in stability. But I also think a lot of my influences of growing up here is also really valuing what I'm passionate about. I think for a huge chunk of my life, I made decisions because it was the right, quote, right decision to make, or the one that my family was going to approve of, or one that was, like you said, not going to rock the boat or make anybody uncomfortable or easy to explain. Like, I'm a doctor, period, right? That's a very easy thing to say. I'm a nonprofit founder who does this. People are like, I don't understand. So I made, I think, too many decisions in my life like that it's been really freeing, I think, now to start making decisions that actually wakes me up in the morning, that I'm excited to do every day. I think I was definitely hitting a point in my career where I just wasn't excited anymore to wake up and do the things that I was doing.
And talking about being excited, has there been one moment in this journey that really lit you up that said, you know what, this is why I'm doing everything. This is why I'm putting up with everything?
Yeah, I think the obvious one is every time we've canceled the debt portfolio, those letters go out. It just feels like, wow, this is real. They're physical envelopes, right? That go out into the world and somebody's going to touch and open. And the earlier batch of those, I hand stamped and closed those envelopes. So it felt very like, oh, wow, like I touched this and now somebody else is going to and is going to touch their lives. I think that's always going to feel special no matter how many times we do it. But actually, another moment that comes to mind is we recently hired our first staff, right? She's part-time staff. She's our fundraising director. She's helping us with fundraising. Really, really valuable addition to our team. She told me recently that working with Deathless, and she started end of March this year, so it's really been just over 6 months, that working with Deathless has really changed her view on the entire financial system and just how passionate she feels now about this work. And I think that's always going to feel really special to me, of that really kind of interpersonal connection we've made, and also just getting us to a point where we are able to have staff, even if it's one part-time staff. That's huge. So
it counts.
Yeah, really excited about that.
And then looking back, is there anything that you wish you'd done differently?
Yeah, I think looking back now, had I had the foresight, I think I would have tried to do more long-term planning earlier on. I think that was a big pivot for us actually at the end of last year, where we really operated for a full year of just, let's see where the next month gets us. We're kind of in that constantly let's just go mode and let's see what happens. And then really the end of last year, which led to our hire now, is slowing down, really evaluating where we're at, making a 1-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. Had I had the room and the foresight to do that earlier, I think that would have helped that first year not feel as scrambled, and maybe help that first year have less of those low points that we talked about earlier. But I also do think that that scrambling was really valuable. I learned a lot very, very quickly, even to a point of like the first time we did mailings with USPS. Leading up to that, I probably spent maybe 5 or 6 hours over the course of a week just at the USPS in Chicago, the main, and just being sent from this office to that office and trying to figure out all that mailing stuff. And it was because our letters had to go out and we didn't have enough money to hire a mail vendor. So I was like, we're going to do this on our own. And had I had the foresight to do a lot more planning, that definitely would have been less hectic. But I think also just me physically being there and running around for that whole week taught me a lot. And now I really know the ins and outs of USPS that otherwise I never would have. And, how to figure out what the nonprofit pricing is and all of that stuff. So I think definitely a lot of value to be had, but a lot of stress and anxiety too.
And what would that planning have covered in retrospect?
I think we would have done probably better financial planning for the whole year of really having a goal of what we want to fundraise and how we're going to get there. I think early on, it was very much, we just need as much money as we can get without really a solid goal of like, this month we want to raise 2,000. Next month we want to raise 2,500 or whatever those numbers should have been at that point in time. And then how do we map back to that, which is where we're at now. We're now at a point where we have distinct fundraising goals that we want to hit at the monthly, quarterly, and yearly mark. And we can really evaluate progress and change and be strategic about this is working. We should keep doing this, or this isn't working. We should stop, which sounds really simple. But early on, it was kind of like, let's do everything because something just has to work and something has to stick to the wall. And we weren't very strategic about how we were fundraising and then, how we're allocating that. And I think that would have been really helpful had I had more of that experience early on.
Last question. What advice would you give other aspiring women entrepreneurs who want to start a nonprofit?
Honestly, I think just go for it. If you identify a need that needs to be filled, which is what we did, then you should go for it. I think that for most of this journey, I had been really scared and really insecure about my abilities to be able to operate an organization like this because this wasn't my background. This wasn't part of my culture to do so. I didn't have any entrepreneurs in my life to look up to or know anybody who was working in the nonprofit world. And really just trust yourself that you have the tools in order to make that happen. If you don't, you can learn. I think that's why for us, it was really important always to be a mission-driven organization of that, like, we're doing email fundraising. If I didn't know how to code an email for an email fundraiser, that's okay, because I can watch a YouTube video and I can learn. But if I didn't believe in the mission of what we were doing, then that's not going to get me up to, that's just not going to do anything. So trust that like the technical things you can learn to do, the paperwork you can learn to fill out, but making sure that it's a mission that actually you're passionate about and fills the need.
Thank you very much, Tina. This has just been an inspiring and very informative conversation for me, and I'm sure for many others as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Tina Tang was one of my most interesting guests because she gave me so many new insights. First, it was eye-opening to learn that big impact can be made through the most boring means possible. Digging through the tax code and untangling how secondary debt markets work isn't really sexy, but the result of that work is truly breathtaking. What are some of the non-obvious ways to have social impact that we haven't thought of? Second, to find those ways, I loved how she followed the money and disregarded the flash factor of what that entailed. She never gave up learning the most obtuse subjects, but while she did that, she never once lost sight of her ultimate goal, and that's how she made sure she didn't lose her way in the details. Third, Tina showed me how maintaining perspective is so important. Despite all the work she's putting into building Deathless, she's very clear that the ultimate goal is not about making Deathless great, but rather about eliminating the core problem of indebtedness she founded it to address in the first place. I love how egoless she is about this mission. The bottom line, for social entrepreneurship to be successful, it's about mission, money, and the best means to get it done. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Find show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achiiv.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or Google Podcast and never miss another episode. Want to help others like you? Leave us a review and tell a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go achieve.